In the 1930s, an army more than 10,000 strong marched on Washington, D.C. A congressman giving an impassioned speech on their behalf would die on the floor of Congress, and a famous World War general would become a villain when he unleashed tanks and tear gas on the men he had once stood beside on the fields and forests of France. The army would lose the battle, but eventually would win the war, the results of which would change the U.S. military forever. But it's one of the least talked about events in U.S. history. When 4 million American soldiers began making their way home from the trenches of France in 1919, they expected that the worst of it was behind them. But little did they know there would be even more challenges ahead. When they left the U.S. to fight overseas, soldiers left their homes, their families, and their jobs behind. During World War I, no protections existed to guarantee soldiers jobs, and many struggled to find work after returning home. For some, they had missed skills and promotions that fellow workers had achieved during their time in France. Others struggled to find work with permanent disabilities ranging from PTSD, then known as shell shock, to blindness to loss of limbs. Veterans found themselves unable to get the factory and labor jobs they'd held before the war. But finding a job wasn't the only problem. The missed wages while they had been overseas also put veterans at a disadvantage. While the soldiers had received a small wage, roughly the equivalent of $1 a day, their counterparts back home had been making $2 to $3 a day, and in some cases, up to $10. The resulting disparity in wealth left veterans frustrated and angry. Veterans began to lobby early on for Congress to right the wrong. They requested a pay differential, money that would make up the difference between the money they actually made and what the average worker back home was making. It quickly became contentious, as some saw it as veterans asking for above and beyond what they were due, with some detractors calling it a bonus. But in 1924, the pay differential request was approved by Congress. There was one significant condition, however. The bonus would not be paid out until 1945, more than 20 years in the future. The only exception was if the veteran died, and then the bonus would be paid out to the next of kin. Many mocked it as the tombstone bonus. On Tuesday, October 29, 1929, the stock market crashed and the economy crashed with it. The United States sunk into the Great Depression. Many people lost their life savings overnight. Others experienced a steep decline into poverty. Jobs, food, and homes were scarce. Veterans were often hit the hardest, and anger grew steadily throughout the early 1930s as veterans refused to wait another decade for money they should have earned in 1918. In 1932, Walter Waters, a World War I veteran from Burns, Oregon, learned of a bill that was going before Congress that advocated for the immediate cash payment of the veteran's bonus. He became passionate about what it would mean for him and so many other veterans. Seeing the success of other lobbying groups in Washington sparked an idea. Veterans just needed their own lobby. Waters gathered a group together to board a rail car and head to Washington. The group called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, or the BEF, in reference to their service in the AEF in World War I. As word of the movement grew, more veterans became interested. Many had no jobs or homes to tie them down, and saw the Bonus Expeditionary Force as the best means to achieve their goals. Through hitching rides and gathering donations in veteran marches, veterans and their families slowly made their way to the Capitol. Newspapers across the country began spreading word of the Bonus Army headed to Washington to take on the politicians. Meanwhile, those in Washington were getting nervous. President Hoover didn't want them to come. MacArthur and others saw them as a communist force and were concerned about civil insurrection and the possibility of a revolution. Pelham Glassford, the D.C. police chief, however, was a World War I vet and felt sympathy for the cause, urging patience to those in leadership. Nevertheless, the army began preparing with gas, tanks, and troops, many of the same hazards the bonus marchers had met with more than a decade before in France. By 1932, over 10,000 bonus marchers had arrived in Washington, and more were on their way. Setting up temporary housing and shacks and erecting tents in front of Congress, veterans banded together. In addition to concerns about communism and revolution, some in Washington also feared the color lines that were being crossed in the BEF camps. African American veterans and white veterans lived side by side, a symbol of hope for desegregation in a deeply divided pre-civil rights era America. Late that spring, Wright Patman of Texas sponsored a bill that would immediately pay the veterans in full. The bill inspired heated debates, with Congressman Edward Eslick dying of a heart attack on the floor of Congress during an impassioned speech promoting the bill. The House of Representatives would pass the bonus bill, 211 to 176, and by June 17, 1932, the bill was being debated in the Senate. Veterans held a vigil outside of Congress, chanting, "The Yanks are starving," and lobbying any member of Congress that would listen. The song, "Brother Can You Spare a Dime," became a rallying cry for veterans and for the country. But the bill would never pass the Senate, and Waters had to inform veterans they'd lost their battle with Washington. On July 16th, as Congress ended its session, senators and representatives were slinking out through secret exits to avoid having to see the veterans still camped on their front lawn demanding answers. The police department and the White House pleaded with veterans to leave, and eventually over 11,000 marchers did, but several thousand remained, refusing to give up. On July 28th, the police began to forcibly evict the veterans from their shanty homes. Chaos ensued as veterans threw objects and police reacted with force. 2 veterans were shot and killed by police, furthering tensions between the veterans and their government. Deciding that the police department was not handling the conflict well, Hoover authorized MacArthur and the military to evict the veterans back across the bridge to Anacostia. MacArthur, along with Patton and other World War I veterans, brought in the cavalry, infantry, and tanks. They began pushing veterans out of the city, using smoke bombs and tear gas. When he reached the bridge, MacArthur decided not to follow Hoover's orders to stop. He instead ordered the troops to continue to pursue, and the veterans in the BEF panicked, believing the troops would kill them. The troops moved through the camps with fury, setting fire to shacks and roughly handling veterans and their families. Later that year, Hoover lost his bid for re-election, and on November 8, 1932, Roosevelt was elected president. The bonus army had been sent home, but veterans continued to show up in Washington every year to call for the release of their money. Though some found work through CCC camps, Roosevelt continued to struggle with the veterans on the subject of the bonus for years. Finally, in 1936, Congress passed the Adjusted Compensation Act. FDR would veto the bill, but Congress would override it. Nearly 18 years after World War I, 4 million veterans were paid in full. As United States involvement in World War II became inevitable, FDR and others began to think about the problems in payment and reintegration for veterans, seeking out a way to resolve many of the inherent problems World War I veterans had faced. In June 1944, the GI Bill was made law. It forged a new relationship between veterans, the military, and the government, and it allowed millions of veterans to go to college, reintegrate if they returned home, create small businesses, and buy homes. If you enjoyed this video, hit subscribe so you can get more history in the future.